"You're in danger, pretend to dance," he whispered in her ear, his breath cool as tomb air, unaware the stranger was the vampire king saving her life. Before we dive into the story, drop a quick comment below telling us where you're watching from, and let me know what draws you to vampire stories. Your engagement helps support this channel. The music swelled, a shimmering cage around the dancers in the grand ballroom. Zara Ellington had never felt more out of place. This ball, hosted by the notoriously predatory Baron Orloff, was meant to finalize the sale of her family's last remaining asset, the deed to the legendary Bloodstone Forest. But the moment she felt the metallic press of a hidden pistol against her back through the crowd, the sale became a death trap. Her breath hitched. That's when a figure materialized from the shadows, a man of unnerving, aristocratic beauty, with long black hair and high, elven ears, dressed in a sweeping emerald velvet coat, just like the image in her mind. Before she could react, he grasped her hand, pulling her into the intricate choreography of a waltz. He drew her close, his profile severe and utterly cold, and whispered the chilling command that shattered her world. "You're in danger, pretend to dance." King Luther Valemont moved them through the crowd with unnerving precision, his eyes scanning the room, as Zara realized her life was now in the hands of a terrifying, elegant stranger who moved like a predator saving its prey. The music had been the problem, too loud, too distracting, too perfectly timed to cover the sound of a silent, deadly instruction. Zara felt the cold, hard press of metal through the silk of her gown, a momentary interruption in the cascade of the waltz. It wasn't a warning, it was a final position. She froze, a small, involuntary gasp caught in her throat. Before the paralysis could set in, he arrived. King Luther Valemont was not merely handsome, he was a catastrophe of beauty, all sharp lines and aristocratic hauteur, his emerald velvet coat an audacious slash against the cream and gold of the ballroom. He didn't ask, he took. His hand, impossibly cool, closed around hers, pulling her from the dangerous periphery and into the whirlwind center of the dance floor. He was unnaturally tall, forcing Zara to tilt her head back to meet the terrifying intensity of his eyes, eyes that held the dark depth of ancient secrets and a cold, predatory intelligence. As he spun her around a cluster of laughing nobles, his lips brushed her ear, sending a shiver that was half fear, half electric shock through her body. "Eyes on me, Zara," Luther commanded, his voice a low, perfectly controlled baritone that somehow cut through the orchestral din. "You are smiling. You are enjoying the dance. You are completely unaware of the man in the blue livery, 3 o'clock, who just tried to put a bullet in your spine." Her smile felt brittle, glued onto a face suddenly pale with terror. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice a strained whisper as he executed a flawless dip, his strong arm supporting her. "Your necessary complication," he retorted, his gaze flicking past her shoulder. "My name is not important. What is important is that Baron Orloff has paid quite handsomely to ensure you do not leave this estate with your signature or your life intact. Your sale contract is a ruse, a distraction for the real payment, your death." The words hit her like a physical blow. The Bloodstone Forest, her family's final hope, was not for sale. It was to be stolen. But why? The price was astronomical. "The land is not priced for gold, little one. It is priced for its history, and that history belongs to me. Orloff is attempting to circumvent the ancient contract by dissolving your bloodline. He needs the land, but he cannot pay the true cost. Killing you is the cheap option." He twirled her sharply, maneuvering them past a velvet curtain just as a man in blue livery, the one from 3 o'clock, made a sudden, clumsy lunge. Luther didn't break rhythm. He simply rotated Zara, his hip catching the assassin's arm with the force of iron, sending the man stumbling and clutching his elbow. The move was so fluid and fast, it looked like a passionate flourish of the dance. "He is fast," Zara whispered, heart hammering against his chest. I am faster, Luther countered, his expression utterly unmoved. Now, we will exit the room. Do not look at the guards. Look only at my face. You are infatuated, remember? The beautiful stranger who has captured your heart. As they reached the edge of the dance floor, Luther gently cupped her cheek, his touch sending a fresh wave of panic through her. His gaze, however, was fixed on something far beyond her. His jaw was tight, and the skin beneath his eyes was unnervingly smooth, giving him a look of ageless, chilling perfection. In that intimate, terrifying moment, Zara saw past the man and glimpsed the ancient creature beneath. He led her through a side door leading into a deserted, darkened conservatory filled with the heavy, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine. He released her only when they were shrouded completely by the shadows of towering potted ferns. Luther turned, his back to the ballroom. His red-flecked eyes met hers, and the playful pretense vanished. The game is over, Zara. I am King Luther Valemont, and I am a creature of the night. You have stumbled into a political maneuver that threatens the fragile truce between my kind and yours. You're in danger because you hold the key to an asset I swore to protect. He stepped closer, dominating the small, enclosed space. You will cooperate, or you will die. The contract Orloff has prepared has a clause. The covenant is fulfilled upon the signature or the death of the final Ellington heir. If he kills you tonight, he takes the land for free. If you want to live and see your family name cleared, you will trust the monster who just saved your life. You need to find the original signed contract papers. I will create the distraction. The air in the conservatory was thick with the scent of jasmine and the sharp, unsettling terror radiating off Zara. She stared at King Luther Valemont, the words "creature of the night" echoing louder than the distant music. She hadn't stumbled into a political negotiation. She had walked into the lair of a mythological predator. You are a vampire, she breathed, the word a ragged sound. A king. Luther's lips curved into a faint, chilling smile that lacked warmth entirely. The title is more inconvenient than majestic, but accurate. I rule the night, and the Bloodstone Forest, the land you were selling, falls under my ancient domain. Its sale is permitted, but the terms of this specific, murderous transaction are not. He stepped toward a glass panel, his gaze piercing the darkness beyond the estate gardens. Baron Orloff is trying to seize an ancient power source hidden beneath that land by exploiting a loophole. He intends to fulfill the contract through a blood sacrifice, yours. My vow dictates that I maintain order and protect the weak against such flagrant, predatory human ambition. Zara hugged herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. The glyph on the contract. What did it mean? It is a forgotten sigil, Luther explained, his voice low and educational, as if discussing geometry. It ensures the covenant only becomes absolute upon the death of the human signatory. Orloff signed a contract stating he would pay a colossal sum, but the moment you die, the contract defaults to a far older, darker term. Ownership reverts immediately to the claimant with the strongest ancient right, Orloff, in this case, by means of an arcane proxy. The revelation was nauseating. This wasn't just theft, it was a ritual murder designed to look like a business failure. Her entire life, built on hope and duty, was a commodity easily discarded. You need to see the original document, Luther continued, turning back to her. Orloff keeps two versions. The one they will sign in 40 minutes is a decoy. The true, original contract, the one with the damning clause and the hidden sigil, is in his private study, locked in a safe behind the false bookcase. You must retrieve it. Zara's mind rebelled. Me? Why can't you simply take it? You're a king, a vampire. You just moved faster than light. And violate the truce in full view of the human court, escalating this from a private murder to open warfare? No. I need to keep Orloff distracted, drawing his network of eyes and guards away from the study. I need a ghost. You, Zara, are the perfect ghost. You're expected to be either dancing or waiting nervously for the signing. No one expects you to be in the study. He reached out, And this time his hand didn't feel cold. It felt electrifying. He gently tilted her chin up. I do not wish to harm you, Zara Ellington, but I require compliance. Your life, and the life of your family, hangs on your ability to outwit a mortal thief. It is time to use the sharp mind I perceive beneath the silk and fear. Can you navigate the Baron's study? Zara swallowed hard, picturing the ancient estate. Her own family had been noble, and she'd spent her childhood in crumbling, labyrinthine homes. She knew the secret routes of servants, the logic of noble architecture, and the common placement of hidden safes. The study is on the ground floor, past the servants' hall, she confirmed, speaking on instinct. There is a loose floorboard in the hall, a key drop point for messages. And Orloff is obsessed with Renaissance architecture. The safe will be hidden behind the panel depicting the fall of Icarus. Luther's eyes narrowed, a flash of approval replacing the cold calculation. Excellent. A valuable piece of information. I will be in the main hall. You have 20 minutes from the moment I begin the diversion. If you fail, I will be forced to act publicly, and that will be messy. Go. He vanished. Not a quick walk, not a sprint, but an instant erasure from the space, leaving behind only the lingering trace of ozone and the scent of damp earth. Left alone in the shadows, Zara pressed her trembling hands against her satin gown. She was terrified, but something hotter than fear was beginning to burn in her stomach, a fierce, protective anger. She had been naive, but she was not weak. She would not be the 18th century blood sacrifice for a petty baron. She smoothed her dress, took a deep, steadying breath, and slipped out of the conservatory and into the hidden corridors reserved for staff, driven by the impossible, terrifying necessity of trusting a vampire king. The back hallways of the Orloff estate were a maze of gray stone and shadowed servants' stairs, a stark, functional contrast to the gilded decadence of the ball. Zara moved quickly, the ruined silk of her gown snagging on rough corners. She was no longer running from danger, but running toward the very heart of the conspiracy, fueled by the cold clarity of a single thought: revenge for her mother's desperate situation. The moment she reached the quiet passage outside the Baron's study, Luther's promised diversion exploded. From the main hall, a furious, resonant sound, a voice that carried the terrifying, controlled authority of a storm, thundered through the walls, demanding answers from the Baron. It was a perfect, loud magnet, drawing every guard and noble eye away from the private wing. Zara used the opportunity, her old knowledge serving her well. She found the small, almost invisible seam in the oak paneling, a trick learned from her great-aunt's derelict mansion. She slipped inside the study. The room was heavy with the scent of aged leather and cigar smoke. The massive fireplace was cold, and the only light came from the pale sliver of moon filtering through a massive stained glass window. Her eyes went immediately to the large Renaissance triptych hanging above the mantel. She recognized the central panel, the Lament of Icarus. Using a small, antique letter opener she'd snatched from a nearby desk, she pressed a sequence of barely noticeable points on the gilt frame, a silent mechanical lock. The heavy panel slid inward with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a polished steel safe. Her fingers, still steady despite the panic surging through her veins, worked the combination. It was a simple 4-digit sequence, likely Orloff's birthday, another classic noble vanity. The lock clicked, and the safe swung open. Inside, beneath stacks of financial ledgers and deeds, she found exactly what Luther described: the original contract on brittle, parchment paper, bearing the sinister, faint glyph. Beside it was a small, locked leather journal. Using the key from the loose floorboard she'd located earlier, she opened the journal. It wasn't a diary. It was a cold, meticulous ledger detailing the acquisition plan. Orloff had hired 3 separate teams of assassins and had prepared a signed confession, ready to be planted on a dead servant, laying the blame on a disgruntled employee. The pages were a chilling blueprint for her murder. She tucked the contract and the journal into the folds of her skirt. Just as she turned to leave, a figure detached itself from the shadows beside the heavy oak door. The chief assassin, a pale, wiry man in black trousers and a velvet vest. He hadn't been drawn away by Luther's theatrics. He had been waiting. "You should have stayed on the dance floor, Lady Ellington," the assassin murmured, his voice flat and expressionless. He held a thin, silver garrote wire taut between his hands. The king's distraction was good, but the Baron prepared for all contingencies. Terror froze Zara for a split second, but the sight of the journal in her hand, the proof of her life's worth, spurred her into action. She didn't have Luther's supernatural speed, but she had desperation. She grabbed the first object she could reach, a heavy, obsidian paperweight carved into a gargoyle's head. She hurled it with all her strength at the brass lamp on the desk, shattering the globe. The sudden, deafening noise and the spray of glass shards momentarily blinded the assassin. In that half-second of advantage, Zara lunged past him, slamming the study door shut behind her and bolting the heavy iron latch. She didn't pause to listen for the crashing of his entry. She flew down the servants' stairs, clutching the damning documents, the desperate energy of survival propelling her toward the main hall and back into the dangerous orbit of King Luther Valemont. The chase had stripped Zara of all aristocratic grace. She burst through a back entrance near the main staircase, the pounding of her heart drowning out the renewed, frantic pulse of the ballroom orchestra. She found the prearranged rendezvous point, the narrow landing of the second-floor portrait gallery, empty, but not silent. She could feel Luther's presence, a low, cold hum of concentrated power in the air. Moments later, he materialized from the shadows of a massive tapestry depicting a medieval hunt, startling her despite her expectation. He was breathing easily, but there was a sharp, calculating focus in his red-flecked eyes. "The diversion worked perfectly," Luther murmured, his gaze immediately falling on the bulging folds of her skirt. "You have the documents." Zara pulled out the contract and the journal, her hands still shaking from the encounter in the study. "Orloff's scheme is worse than you thought. He planned to frame a servant for my murder. He detailed the entire execution. And the assassin, he was waiting for me." Luther took the journal, his long fingers swiftly turning the pages. He scanned the neat, murderous handwriting, his expression hardening into an unreadable mask of glacial fury. "The contempt of mortals never ceases to astound me," he said, handing the documents back. "You have the proof. We will expose him publicly at the moment of the signing, exactly 15 minutes from now." He turned toward the grand archway leading back to the hall, but froze. A low, sibilant whisper escaped his lips. "Too late. Your friend from the study is efficient. He's brought company." A group of 4 men, led by the chief assassin, were spreading out silently on the landing below, blocking the stairs. Their movements were too coordinated, too precise for mere house guards. They were hunters. "They won't risk open fire with the main ballroom in sight," Zara whispered, desperately searching for another exit. The gallery was a long, open room flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows on one side and priceless, heavy canvases on the other. It was a beautiful death trap. "They won't need to," Luther countered, stepping in front of her. "The assassin knows I am here now. This has escalated from protecting a victim to hunting a king. He seeks to incapacitate me and reclaim the asset. You stay behind me, Zara. Do not flinch." The chief assassin stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Luther. "The Baron apologizes, Your Majesty," the man drawled, his voice laced with cold mockery. "But you overstepped. The girl is a necessary sacrifice. Hand her over, and we can all pretend this was just a mistake." Luther's response was a chilling display of control. "You confuse my restraint with timidity. I gave your master a chance to be merely a fool. He chose to be a corpse." The moment the last word left his lips, the 4 assassins rushed forward. Luther became a blur, an emerald shadow cutting through the space. He intercepted the first man with a devastating, silent blow that cracked against the stone wall. The second and third were disarmed and thrown back against the canvases with effortless speed. But the chief assassin was skilled, his movements anticipating the vampire's supernatural speed, armed with a spring-loaded blade. The assassin lunged, forcing Luther to deflect the blow with a hiss. The clash of metal against the king's hidden forearm armor echoed through the quiet gallery. Luther was now wholly engaged, his focus split, his movement becoming subtly less perfect because of the need to keep his charge protected. "We cannot fight here," Zara yelled, pointing towards a massive, carved clock at the end of the gallery. "We need to get to the main hall. It's almost midnight. Time is up." The chief assassin saw his chance. He feigned a move toward Luther, but pivoted instantly toward Zara, his blade arcing toward her throat. Luther reacted in a flash, slamming his body into the man, but the attack had sealed their fate in the gallery. They were pinned between the assassins and the 20-foot drop of the balcony overlooking the foyer. "We have reached the point of no return," Luther ground out, his eyes blazing with power. "Hold tight, little one. The reckoning begins now." He pulled her tight against his side, preparing for a suicidal leap. The chief assassin's blade was a whisper away from Zara's throat. There was no time for calculation, no space for doubt. Luther didn't leap. He simply pushed a violent, sudden shove that sent Zara tumbling over the ornate wrought iron railing of the second-floor balcony. For a sickening half-second, she experienced the free fall, the world rushing up to meet her in a terrifying blur of marble and crystal, the original contract documents clutched tight to her chest. Then the fall stopped. Luther was beneath her, his body a solid anchor, his unnatural speed arresting their descent with such precision that they landed in the dimly lit foyer below with less sound than a dropped velvet glove. The assassins above gaped down at the impossible feat, their movements momentarily stalled by sheer disbelief. The king had abandoned concealment entirely, choosing brazen exposure over a slow, quiet death. "Run!" Luther hissed, already moving toward the main ballroom doors. They entered the hall precisely at 11:50. The orchestra was mid-swell, the dancers whirling in a blissful ignorance of the carnage unfolding in the shadows. The atmosphere of wealth and false security was intoxicating, and it was about to shatter. Luther released Zara and, with the terrifying, unhurried gait of a force of nature, strode directly into the center of the dance floor. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer force of his presence seemed to compress the air, a vacuum of authority that silenced the violins one by one. By the time he reached the center mosaic, the entire room was still. Nobles froze mid-step, their false smiles fixed on their faces, gazing in paralyzing fear at the figure in the emerald coat, whose every movement radiated ancient, undeniable power. Luther looked past the terrified guests, his blazing eyes seeking out Baron Orloff by the signing table. The Baron, portly and preening moments before, suddenly looked sickly pale, his hand trembling on the edge of the mahogany. "The music stops," Luther announced, his voice carrying the cold resonance of stone, utterly devoid of mercy. "And the festivities cease. You, Baron Orloff, are under my detention. I am King Luther Vailmont, and your petty, murderous treason is concluded." A wave of confused whispers swept the room. Some nobles scoffed, believing the man to be a rogue magician or a lunatic. Others, the more ancient and politically astute, recognized the impossible truth and shrank back, terror transforming their faces. Orloff, however, recovered his nerve, realizing this was his last stand. "You dare interrupt a legal transaction, madman?" he blustered, trying to sound outraged. He gestured sharply towards the decorative staff surrounding the signing table. That gesture was the signal. With terrifying speed, the line of footmen and waiting pages dropped their silver trays and pulled heavy pistols, aiming not just at Luther, but at Zara. A massive contingent of armed mercenaries, disguised impeccably in livery, flooded the entryways. The glamour of the ball disintegrated into a tableau of terror, the crystal chandeliers reflecting the cold gleam of dozens of barrels. The king was exposed, and Orloff was ready to wager everything on overwhelming force. "So be it," Luther murmured, a terrible, cold satisfaction entering his eyes. He shielded Zara with one arm, his emerald coat billowing around them like a protective shadow. "If you wished for war, Baron, you should have dressed better for the slaughter." The ballroom became a maelstrom of fear and metallic sound. The mercenaries, trained professionals, wasted no time. A volley of fire roared toward the center, aimed solely at the man in the emerald coat. But the volley struck empty air. King Luther Valemont was no longer standing where he had been. He was a flicker, an emerald blur, a destructive shadow, moving faster than the eye could follow. He did not kill. His philosophy, hard and precise, dictated that he only spilled blood when a sacred law was broken, and these men were mere tools. Instead, the force of his strikes was terrifyingly efficient. Pistols were wrenched from hands and flung to shatter the crystal punch bowls. Rifle stocks were snapped over knee joints. Mercenaries, big, heavily muscled men, were lifted and tossed into the massive decorative flower arrangements, where they crumpled into silent, stunned heaps. The entire attack was neutralized in a matter of seconds, transforming a prepared firing squad into an incoherent pile of broken limbs and scattered weaponry. But in the thick of the chaos, the chief assassin was different. He had not fired. He had moved to intercept Zara. He knew the true target was the evidence she held. "The king fights the noise," the assassin snarled, lunging across the blood-red carpet. "I claim the silence." Zara had been trained since childhood in the composure of the nobility, and in that moment, the training paid off. She knew she couldn't run, and she knew Luther was too occupied with the dozen other combatants to focus on her. She took 2 steady steps forward, out of Luther's immediate shadow, and raised the small, leather-bound journal and the old parchment contract high above her head. The fight, ferocious and fast, had drawn the human guests back from their initial terror. They were witnessing the impossible, a man of inhuman grace dismantling an army. But they were nobility, and their deepest fear was scandal, not fangs. Zara's voice was quiet, trembling only slightly, but amplified by the sudden cessation of the mercenaries' guns and the king's focused battle. "Silence. Look at this." She read from the journal, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth over the moans of the disarmed. "This is Baron Orloff's hand. He is not financially solvent. He is not a benefactor. He is bankrupt, and this contract, the sale of the Bloodstone Forest, was never about the money." She flipped the page, pointing to a column of figures. "He needed the land for the ancient energy source beneath it, and the price was simply too high." He wrote, "The easiest solution is the permanent removal of the final heir." The silence that followed was heavier than the music had been. The assembled nobility, all partners, rivals, and friends of the Baron, gazed first at the journal in Zara's steady hand, then at the defeated, whimpering mercenaries, and finally at Baron Orloff, who had retreated behind the signing table, his face a mask of ruined panic. The king, in the meantime, was locked in a deadly ballet with the chief assassin. The assassin was not supernatural, but he was ruthless, using the chandeliers, the pillars, and even the stunned nobles as cover. He managed to drive the blade toward Luther's flank, and for the first time, a small tear appeared in the king's velvet coat, a drop of something dark and ancient staining the fabric. "Luther!" Zara cried out, momentarily forgetting her performance. The moment of distraction cost the assassin dearly. Luther seized the opportunity, his movements suddenly accelerating past even his previous speed. The assassin's weapon was twisted from his grip, his arm was locked in a brutal, irreversible position, and he was hurled across the entire length of the ballroom, crashing through the grand, mirrored doors leading to the conservatory. He did not rise. The mercenaries were done. The assassin was defeated. All that remained was Zara's voice and the broken form of the Baron. "He intended to murder me tonight to seize the land for free," Zara concluded, her composure now perfectly restored, her eyes burning with an incandescent fury that matched the king's. "I am the victim of a calculated, aristocratic murder plot disguised as commerce. I ask the court, is this the standard of honor that governs this nation?" The sheer evidence, the undeniable display of violence coupled with the exposure of the baron's financial ruin and the explicit text of the journal, was overwhelming. The nobles turned on Orloff. They were terrified of the vampire king, but they were more terrified of association with a public scandal and an exposed murderer. Whispers of disgust and betrayal rippled through the crowd, quickly escalating to angry shouts. Baron Orloff was finished, condemned by his own avarice and the courage of the girl he thought was too naive to fight back. Luther, his velvet coat still immaculate despite the tear, walked calmly back to Zara's side, his gaze never leaving the Baron. He extended a hand, gently taking the original contract from her. The battle was over, and the reckoning was about to begin. The silence that followed Zara's final accusation was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic drip of crystal punch onto the marble floor. King Luther Valemont stood beside her, a terrifying portrait of poised stillness. The chief assassin remained unconscious amidst the wreckage of the conservatory doors, and the remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader fall to such cold, impossible power, were either fleeing or dropping to their knees, disarmed and defeated. All eyes were on Baron Orloff. Stripped of his armed protection, his dignity, and his carefully constructed facade, he was just a desperate, middle-aged man facing ruin. The weight of the collective noble gaze, no longer one of deference, but of horrified, political rejection, crushed him. He saw his peers not as friends, but as judges. The stain of murder, combined with the shame of bankruptcy, was a social death sentence worse than any blade. Orloff crumpled behind the mahogany signing table, sinking slowly until he was kneeling, his face buried in his hands. "Desperate," he choked out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. It was desperation. The investments failed, the bank called the note, I had no choice. The Bloodstone Forest has a geothermal source, a fortune in energy. I needed it, and the Ellington girl was the simplest way to clear the claim. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, not at Luther, but at the nearest duke. It was only one woman. A necessary casualty. The confession, raw and pitiful, served only to solidify the human court's condemnation. The Duke, a man of enormous political weight, recoiled visibly. No matter the king's terrifying nature, the Baron had committed an unforgivable sin. He had violated the rules of the game and had invited supernatural intervention into human affairs. Luther, standing tall and glacial, ignored the Baron completely. He addressed the Duke. "The contract is invalid. It was rooted in deceit and sealed with the intent of murder. Furthermore, the land in question falls under the ancient Treaty of Size, which forbids the transfer of ownership based on a non-consensual blood payment." He handed the original parchment and the Baron's journal to the Duke. "Examine the glyph. Consult your own ancient archivists. The sale is null and void." The Duke, his hands shaking slightly as he took the documents, knew better than to argue with the vampire king, especially one who had just demonstrated such calculated, devastating power in the heart of the capital. "The contract is nullified," the Duke announced, his voice regaining its authority, a desperate attempt to restore order. "The Ellington claim to the Bloodstone Forest is immediately reaffirmed. Baron Orloff is detained under charges of attempted murder and treason against the crown for inviting destabilizing forces and violence into this hall." The sudden political efficiency was astounding. Zara watched as the nobles performed an immediate, frantic pivot, striving to prove their loyalty to the status quo and the fragile truce. A countess rushed to Luther's side, offering a sweeping, terrified apology for the Baron's transgression. A marquis offered his personal guard to escort Zara home. They were desperate to smooth over the fissure in reality Luther's presence had created. Luther waved them away with a gesture of regal disinterest. The only apology I require is that you remember the consequence of preying on the weak, human or otherwise. The ancient boundaries were crossed by a mortal's greed. Ensure it does not happen again. The crisis had passed. Zara stood amidst the ruins, the broken glass, the upturned tables, the silent dread radiating from the fleeing nobility. Her family's name was cleared, her life was saved, and the land was secure. But the air was heavy with more than just fear. It was thick with the undeniable knowledge that the supernatural world was not a myth, and she was now inextricably linked to its most powerful ruler. She had chosen to trust the vampire king over the human noble, and now she had to face the consequence of that terrifying choice. The grand ballroom felt impossibly hollow. The fleeing nobility had taken the warmth and sound with them, leaving behind a cold, marble expanse punctuated by wreckage. Only two figures remained, Zara Ellington, holding the remnants of her shredded silk gown, and King Luther Valemont, standing perfectly still beneath the shattered chandelier. The air was thick with unspoken truths and the dizzying exhilaration of survival. Luther moved to the table, sweeping aside the broken crystal with the toe of his elegant boot. He looked at Zara, his fierce, red-flecked gaze softening slightly from the battle-ready glare to something intensely thoughtful. "You are safe now, Zara," he stated, his voice stripped of its previous regal thunder, returning to the low, conversational baritone she remembered from their desperate waltz. "The contract is void. Your land is protected. Your mother's resources are secure. My obligation is fulfilled. You are free to return to your world." He stepped closer, and this time, the coldness that emanated from him wasn't hostile. It was the natural chill of power restrained. "But I must issue a final warning. You have seen behind the veil. You have heard my name. The human court may applaud your courage, but they will never forget what you saw, and they will never trust the girl who is favored by the King of Night. You are a known contact point. The dangers will not cease. They will merely change form. You will spend your life looking over your shoulder, forever hunted by those who seek to use your connection to me." He paused, offering her an escape, a path back to a normal life that no longer existed. "Go. Live quietly. Find a place where the shadows do not fall." Zara felt the terror, the very real, primal fear of a creature who could end her life with a gesture. But beneath that fear, the anger that had driven her through the study and into the confrontation remained, burning steady and bright. She was no longer the desperate debutante seeking a lifeline. She was the woman who had stared down a murderer and exposed a king. She met his gaze without flinching. "I am no longer the girl who came to this ball, Your Majesty." That girl would have run. But the woman who stands here, who held the proof of her own impending murder in her hands, knows that running is just a slow way to die. She took a decisive step towards him, narrowing the physical distance between them, a profound act of agency. "You speak of a hunting problem? I have knowledge of the hunters. I know their codes, their vanity, their weaknesses. You saved my life because Baron Orloff's greed violated your vow to protect the innocent and the sanctity of your domain. You risked yourself for a principle, not for me." "Correct," Luther confirmed, his expression unreadable. "Then let us honor that principle with more than just a momentary intervention," Zara proposed, her voice clear and strong. "I refuse to be a quiet victim. If I am to be a target regardless, I choose to be a necessary partner. I propose a new alliance, one based on free will, not coercion." She looked directly into his ancient, powerful eyes. "I will use my political fluency, my knowledge of the human court, and my now reaffirmed legal ownership of the Bloodstone Forest to act as your buffer. I will ensure no mortal attempt to exploit the land or violate the ancient truce ever reaches your attention again. In return, I ask for a single, enduring guarantee, your protection for me and my family, and the continued existence of my agency. I will work with you, King Luther Valemont, not for you. I choose this." The intensity in Luther's eyes deepened, shifting from scrutiny to something akin to respect. He had clearly expected terror and retreat. He had received defiance and a political strategy. The offer was audacious, logical, and entirely voluntary. It broke every convention of human-vampire relations, which were always built on forced obedience or blood debt. He considered her for a long, silent moment, the silence of centuries. Finally, a genuine, powerful smile, cold but compelling, touched his lips. It was the smile of a predator who had found something far more valuable than prey. A partnership, then, founded on choice, Luther murmured. He extended his hand, not in an offer to dance, but in an offer of binding commitment. His skin, now that she was close, was cool, smooth, and impossibly firm. The old fear is replaced by mutual, necessary respect. It is done, Baroness Zara Ellington. You have purchased your freedom with your courage. And I believe I have gained a most invaluable ally. Zara grasped his hand, sealing the covenant. It was a terrifying bond, forged in blood and lies, but founded on her own fierce, autonomous decision. In that moment, she transformed from a pawn into a player, a queen allied with the king of night. Weeks passed since the night of the ball, and the memory of the shattered crystal and the cold fury of King Luther Valemont became the new, defining political reality. Zara Ellington was no longer the desperate girl with a debt. She was the Baroness of the Bloodstone Forest, the one who had survived a political execution and forced the disgrace of Baron Orloff. The Duke and the other nobility, desperate to bury the shame and prevent the King of Night from ever having cause to intervene so dramatically again, moved swiftly. Orloff was stripped of his titles and wealth, vanishing into the shadows of the justice system, a fate perhaps colder than death. Zara's ancestral claim was secured with absolute legal finality. Her mother, safely moved and cared for with the first of the new forest revenues, finally began to recover, her mind eased by the end of the family's long, slow ruin. Zara's life was transformed, but her world was irrevocably split. By day, she operated within the human court, coolly negotiating the establishment of the Bloodstone Forest Conservancy, her new reputation as the formidable Baroness preceding her. Nobles who had once patronized her now deferred, unnerved by the steel she had developed and the powerful, unspoken shadow that trailed her. By night, she worked in the shadows. King Luther Valemont kept his word. He never commanded her, but he sought her counsel. She would meet him in ancient, forgotten places, a hidden gazebo in the depths of the forest, or a silent chamber in his own mountain fortress. She taught him the subtle art of mortal politics, which noble's ambition was genuine, whose apology was hollow, and which financial deal was a concealed trap designed to tempt his species into violating the truce. She was his eyes and his translator in the baffling, deceitful world of human greed. She had learned that power was not inherited, nor was it bestowed. The greatest power was the simple, fierce ability to choose one's path. She had chosen to walk beside a predator, not as his prey or his possession, but as his equal, earned through courage and intellect. The fear she first felt for him had settled into a profound, intense respect, laced with the dangerous, vital awareness of his raw, ancient power. One evening, as the moon rose high over the newly secured Bloodstone Forest, Zara stood with Luther on a high, crumbling balcony overlooking the vast, dark expanse of the woods. The air was cool, smelling of pine and ozone. The forest was utterly silent, secured by the vigilance of its new masters. Luther, dressed in his familiar dark velvet, turned to her. "The human world settles quickly, Zara. They have forgotten the fire, but they respect the scar. You have stabilized the entire western border for my domain. It is an extraordinary accomplishment for one who was meant to be a forgotten tragedy." "It was easy," Zara replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "They only respect force. I simply showed them yours and ensured they remembered mine." She extended her hand toward him. Luther's eyes, catching the moonlight, held a flicker of something ancient and beautiful, a depth of feeling she was only beginning to perceive. He took her hand, his cool fingers wrapping around hers. It was a gesture of partnership, a silent, powerful covenant forged not in blood, not in a desperate whisper, but in mutual choice and earned respect. The last of the gold light faded from the sky, leaving them standing together as the undisputed heir and the king, united by the bold decision that broke the mold of history. Their alliance was a secret, dangerous, and thrilling foundation for a new age, and it was entirely, fiercely her own.